In the summer of 1759, Wolfe brought the British fleet and expeditionary force up the St. Lawrence River, sealing off Quebec from the water and trying to draw Montcalm out of his defensive posture. On the French side, Montcalm relied on the city's immense natural strength. Quebec stood high above the river's steep cliffs looking down over the water, with defensive lines and difficult shore approaches in front of it. For weeks, the British bombarded, staged harassing landings, and struck at Beauport, yet still could not break through the main French defenses east of the city. Wolfe was being crushed by time as the campaigning season began to close, while Montcalm needed only to hold him long enough for winter, and the strain of supply lines to suffocate the British effort. It was in that deadlock that Wolfe turned to his boldest plan. Not to attack where the French were waiting, but to secretly move his troops across the river, land beneath the cliffs southwest of Quebec, climb onto the plateau, and force Montcalm to fight from a position of reaction. On the night of September 12 into the early hours of September 13, the river lay black cold, and so still that any clumsy stroke of an oar could have ruined everything. British boats left their ships and drifted with the current toward Anse, Foulon, a narrow landing place at the foot of the slope, where the French had posted guards, though far fewer than at Beauport. Wolfe's plan depended entirely on surprise. Move in the dark, answer the sentries in French, hit the shore fast. Then send the advance parties climbing the path before the French could raise a general alarm. If they were detected too early, the British would be trapped between the river and the cliffs, shattered by fire from above. But the landing succeeded. The British advance force closed in, drove off the French guard near the path, and opened the way up to the plateau. Then, one by one, British units pulled themselves up from the river's edge and formed on the flat ground above the cliffs. When dawn began to break, the sight no one in Quebec wanted to see had become real. A substantial British force was standing in line on the Plains of Abraham, not far from the city itself. Wolfe understood perfectly that he did not have many hours. Once French forces from the surrounding areas gathered in strength, especially if they brought up artillery and pressed both flanks, the British army that had just climbed the slope could be crushed. So the first priority was to deploy quickly. The British spread into a fairly long line on the plateau, their rear sustained by the possibility of movement from the riverside, their front facing Quebec and the directions from which the French would come. This was not a perfect open lawn. The ground was broken by rough patches, brush fences, and farmland that cut up the formation, forcing Wolfe to thin his line in order to maintain frontage. Yet the calmness of the deployment was what mattered most. Instead of rushing the city, he built a wall of infantry in the middle of the plateau and waited for the enemy to attack. The British regiments were ordered to hold their fire, stand firm, and not shoot too soon. That discipline was a matter of survival, because if they fired at long range across broken ground, Wolfe's thin line would never have enough weight of fire to stop a French assault. News struck Quebec like a blade of ice. Montcalm now had to decide within minutes. He could wait for more troops from the outer sectors. He could cling to the city and its works to pin the British down. But there was also a very real fear. If Wolfe was allowed to stand firm on the plateau, the British would bring up more troops, place artillery, cut the road linking Quebec with the interior, and turn the city itself into a trap for the French. Though Montcalm chose immediate action, he pulled the forces he had at hand out of their positions around the city and Beauport, and pushed them quickly toward the battlefield. That decision gave the entire engagement its fierce tempo, but it also meant the French entered the fight before their formation was fully assembled. The units did not arrive in perfect order. Their march was uneven, and some regular troops were mixed with colonial militia, all forced to deploy in haste over awkward ground. Even so, Montcalm did not want to give the British more time. He chose to attack that very morning, before Wolfe could turn the daring night landing into a foothold that could not be uprooted. From the direction of Quebec City, the French line gradually came into view across the plain. They advanced out to face the British in the early morning light, and before them stood a silent red line waiting. The distance between the two sides narrowed little by little. When the morning light fully spread across the plain, the two armies could see each other completely. There was no longer any secrecy, no longer any quiet path of withdrawal under cover of darkness. Now only one thing remained. Whoever could withstand the first collision would keep Quebec. Wolfe stood before a thin line of troops that had already settled into order. Montcalm brought his forces out quickly, determined to strike at once before the British could put down roots on the plateau. That decision turned the next few dozen minutes into one of the fiercest confrontations of the colonial wars in North America. According to compiled accounts from Britannica, the Canadian Encyclopedia, and Parks Canada, the main battle on September 13 was very short, but the decisive blow lay in Montcalm's rushed attack against the British formation that had just secured its position on the plains of Abraham. The French moved out from the area of the city and nearby positions in a state of haste and intense pressure. They did not enter the battle as one solid, fully formed mass, but as several fragments of force pushed forward as quickly as possible to smash Wolfe's foothold before it could harden. On uneven ground mixed with brush, fences, footpaths, and irregular patches of farmland, the French formation had difficulty keeping a straight line. Some regular units still tried to maintain their ranks, but mixed among them were Canadian militia and sharpshooters who clung to the edges of trees and thickets on the flanks to harass the enemy. Wolfe, meanwhile, chose a method so simple it was chilling. He did not rush to seize the city, did not stage any complicated maneuver, but drew up his men in line, stretched them thin while preserving the widest possible front, and reduced the entire battle to one single question: could the British keep their nerve until the exact moment to fire? The Canadian Encyclopedia makes clear that Montcalm decided to attack quickly before the British could fortify, and sources on the battle consistently show that the terrain and the haste had already robbed the French formation of cohesion before even closed in. On the British left, French marksmen and irregular troops hidden in low trees and brush continued to fire harassing shots. They were not strong enough to break the British line at once, but they forced British soldiers to endure pressure from two directions. In front of them was the French formation pressing forward, while on the flank came scattered but troublesome fire. Wolfe understood that if his men lost their composure and fired too early, the red line would empty itself out. For that reason the order was repeated. Hold the line, keep silent, wait until they are very close. The longer they let the enemy come on, the greater the danger, but the greater the reward as well. It was a style of fighting that demanded iron discipline. A line of soldiers stood still watching the enemy advance, hearing bullets hiss past, seeing comrades fall, and yet still not being allowed to pull the trigger. It would take only one platoon firing too early for the whole rhythm of fire to collapse. Britannica and the classic accounts of this battle all emphasize the crucial point that the British held their fire until close range, making the volley that followed decisively destructive. Then the distance closed. The French began firing first, but their volleys did not carry the weight they had intended. The formation had advanced too quickly over bad ground. The ranks were shaking and uneven, and the fire became ragged as a result. Some units fired too early, others had not yet come into sync, so the entire French front failed to produce a single simultaneous blow strong enough to throw the British off their position. This was the moment Wolfe had been waiting for. When the French had come very close, the British line finally fired together. It was not a chaotic, prolonged exchange of gunfire, but a short, compressed blow exploding straight into the mass of troops surging forward. British fire at close range tore through the French front ranks. Gaps immediately opened in the advancing formation. Men fell, others recoiled, those behind crashed into those in front, and the momentum of the assault was lost in an instant. According to accounts widely repeated and summarized by Britannica and the Canadian Encyclopedia, the British held their fire until the French were close, then unleashed very heavy volleys that became the breaking point of the French formation. But Wolfe did not stop there. Immediately after the first volley, the British did not stand rooted in place waiting for the enemy to recover. They stepped forward a few paces, tightened the distance even more, and delivered a second volley. It was this successive blow that truly cut the tendons of the attack. If the first volley stunned the French, the second made them lose all momentum. From a hurried offensive, the French formation turned into a fractured mass. The gaps widened, the ranks tilted and wavered, and units still trying to push on suddenly realized that their flanks had already slowed or fallen back. Once the advance had been halted, the British immediately charged with bayonets. On that narrow plain, the bayonet was not merely a finishing weapon, it was a signal of morale. Whichever side still had the nerve to surge forward after two volleys was the side taking possession of the field. Wolfe had turned a thin line into a wall that knew how to endure, how to fire, and how to advance at the exact right moment. Britannica clearly describes that after the close-range volley, the British stepped forward and delivered more fire, causing the French to break apart and retreat. At the very moment victory was opening before him, Wolfe was hit by gunfire. His death did not come after the battle in quiet, but in the very middle of its most decisive moment. The general who had gambled everything on the night landing, and the morning battle did not live to see the full outcome sealed. But the British did not break because of his death. The machine was already in motion. His subordinate commanders kept the rhythm, pushed the line forward, and forced the French to turn back. On the other side, Montcalm was also wounded while trying to keep his men from disintegrating. That is the most tragic and brutal feature of the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. Both supreme commanders fell on the same morning while the fate of the colony was turning. Parks Canada and Britannica both confirm that Wolfe was killed on the day of the fighting, while Montcalm was mortally wounded and died the following morning.